Chapter 2. The bombs continued to fall. The tall woman watched as a church was hit, exploding into silent flame. She twisted the dial on her binoculars, zooming in on the shrieking people pouring out as the fire took hold. Women, children, their prayers all come to nothing. What else did they expect? The tall woman hadn't slept. She never could when the enemy were near. She felt nothing for them, though, the people out there. She watched them suffer and fall, but her hands were steady as she held the binoculars. It might have been different were she in among them. Up here, away out of the danger, it made it easier to deal with. She had the top floor of the tallest building in England, and the bombers would not dare come near. Yet her office, the pyramid at the top of the building, bestowed only limited power. She could watch it all happening around her, but there was nothing she could do, nothing she wasn't already doing anyhow. The city had to and for itself until her work was completed. "Sir?" She turned from the window. Her current orderly hovered in the doorway. Belcher, his name was. He couldn't be more than 17, young enough to be her grandson. Children fought this war for them now. They were committed from birth to battling the aggressor, fighting for values and a way of life they'd never even known. The boy looked terrified, not of the apocalypse going on outside, but of her. The tall woman liked to conjure that attitude in those around her, to demand their respect. At her nod, Belcher came forward. He handed over a memo, folded and sealed. She split the seal with her thumb, turning so the boy couldn't read what was written. Her hands began to quaver as she read. She felt her heart thumping. "When did you get this?" "Minutes ago, sir," the boy replied. General Bamford nodded. This had to be it. This had to be them. "Righto," she said. "Let's get down there." The body-shaped parcel wedged in around her feet was more horrifying than the body had been on its own. Barbara couldn't tear her gaze from it. From him. She found herself hypnotized by the dead man's suede shoes poking out of the end of the fabric. They were square-toed, unlike anything she'd ever seen before. Elastic sides meant no need for laces. They looked more like running shoes, she thought. They looked comfortable. The revelation of this detail, this insight into the man's life, filled her with sudden grief. "It's all going to be all right, my dear," said the doctor, still holding on to her hand. "Oi," said the policewoman sat opposite them. "I said no talking." Barbara squeezed the doctor's hand, praying he wouldn't answer back. What could have happened here? Why were they treated like criminals? The police must think they had killed the man. Did that mean that Ian and Susan hadn't yet found a phone, that they had not been able to explain? The armoured car swung violently round a corner, and the doctor crashed into her side. His weight surprised her. Often he could seem so frail and fragile. The two pole benches on either side of the van afforded little comfort or suspension. Even the policewoman seemed miserable about sitting in the back. It made it harder to look threatening, Barbara thought. The car stopped suddenly, and at first Barbara thought they'd met an obstacle. The policewoman opened the doors, letting in the silvery moonlight. She and her colleagues bundled the body out. Then one policeman jabbed his gun toward Barbara and the doctor. "Out," the policeman said. Barbara stepped carefully down from the van. Her skirt didn't make that easy. Overhead loomed a tall, featureless block of a building, reminding her of pictures from communist Russia. It had no windows. A banner by the guarded front doors proclaimed, "Bing Street Correction Facility." Looking back behind the van, Barbara estimated the skyscrapers was something like half a mile away. They were a different world compared to this grim place. Between the tall buildings and where she stood, a dark sea of overgrowth swallowed up the pale light. Small buildings, the ruins of houses and shops, peeped out of the surface, entirely overrun by weeds. The relics of her own time, she felt certain. She was so nearly home, and yet the place was as alien to her as anywhere else their travels had taken them. She helped the doctor climb down from the car. He took his time, slower and more arthritic than ever. The tall escalator at the entrance to the station had taken it out of him, but she had never seen him like this. He was doubled up with pain and effort. It could have been the drive, bumping around in the back of the van. Or, as he had said, was there really something in the air? When he had both feet on the ground, she let him go. He tottered forward, and she had to catch him again. "Are you feeling all right?" "Eh?" said the doctor, staring all around like a madman. As his eyes passed over hers, she thought he might have winked. "The man is confused?" a policeman asked, making no move to help. "He's just tired," said Barbara. "We have immediate powers where confused vagrants are concerned," the man said, prodding his gun in the doctor's side. The doctor swatted the rifle away with the back of his hand and stood up straight. His eyes gleamed. "I'll have you know that I am perfectly sensible," he said. Clearly it had all been an act. "We'll see," said the policeman. He kept the gun on them while he closed and locked the armoured car. "It's martial law," Barbara whispered. The doctor stroked his chin, more fascinated than frightened. When the policeman gestured with the end of the rifle to get them moving, the doctor just shook his head wearily, as if conceding to play a child's game. He led Barbara into the facility. Still hidden, Ian and Susan watched Colonel Andrews examine the station entrance. The night was cold, and Ian realised Susan only had on her short-sleeved blouse and dungarees. He slipped off his suit jacket and draped it round her shoulders. She grinned at him, drawing the jacket around her. Ian tried not to let on how cold he now felt. Across the courtyard from them, Andrews had spent minutes searching for something. Ian noted the systematic, practical way the man worked, starting at one end of the station entrance and slowly making his way across to the other. Sometimes he would stop to make notes in a pocketbook. Despite his scientific approach, however, he clearly couldn't find what he wanted. Ian could see the man's frustration as he clapped his notebook shut and stuffed it back into his lab coat pocket. Andrews seemed uncertain. He stayed safely under the veil of the station entrance, looking out at the buildings around him and across the marina. He withdrew his notebook again and wrote several pages. He glanced frequently up to look again at the buildings as he did so. Ian had begun to think the man would never move, that he and Susan would have to approach him, when Andrews took off at a confident pace. He made his way round the far edge of the marina, the same route they had taken earlier. He moved quickly, as if late for some appointment. They watched him as he approached the same heavy-gated building they had called on before. He made his way up to the main gate and rang the bell. "He's going to get himself shot," said Ian, stepping forward from their hiding place. Susan grabbed his arm. "It's too dangerous, Ian," she said. "You mustn't." "I can't let him go to his death, can I?" "He looks like he knows what he's doing," she replied, a strange look in her eye. Susan was usually the one to rush headlong into trouble. What had got into her now? "I'm sure we did too, Susan. He needs our help." "But he's dead," she insisted. "He's looking quite well for it. He will be dead. We saw him. We know how he's going to die." Across the water, they could just see the same tired guard make his way out of the building lobby, collecting the shotgun on his way. "Yes," said Ian. "And that's why the guard made his way outside. He raised his gun and lowered it again." He didn't seem to recognize Andrews, Ian thought, but they exchanged a few words quite amiably. The guard considered whatever Andrews had asked him, then pointed out across the marina to precisely where Ian and Susan were hiding. They sank back into the shadows, Ian putting himself between Susan and the gunman. But the guard did not shoot. He continued talking to Andrews, pointing off to the left. Andrews nodded, repeating the gestures. "He's getting directions," said Susan. "He didn't see us at all." "So it seems," said Ian. "He doesn't know where he is." "No," said Ian. He smiled. and if he's a stranger here, he won't know us from Adam." "We can't get involved, Ian. Grandfather would..." "Would he? We don't know anything for sure, though, do we?" Ian's eyes twinkled. "We need more evidence before we can make assumptions." "But we can't." Andrews thanked the guard and made his way back round the marina towards them. The guard disappeared back inside. "Susan, he's somebody important, or that guard would have shot at him. We'll need him on our side if we're going to help the others." "We mustn't." Andrews had passed the marina and continued to get nearer. He was just a few yards away. Ian didn't move. Susan's insistence had got to him. She was terrified, and her instincts had proved correct in the past. A shape leapt out on Andrews and he fell back. The shape was a ragged man, wild-haired and wild-eyed. The tramp had his hands round the colonel's throat. He snarled as he throttled the man. Susan held on to Ian, trying to hold him back. "We can't get involved," she said quietly. Ian slipped from her grasp. "Susan," he said, "we got involved the moment we stepped out of the TARDIS. I can't not help him now." Barbara had never been inside a police station before. She wondered how different this place was to the Coal Hill station of her own time. It didn't feel like the future. She and the doctor were marched past the front desk, the policeman stationed there nodding at his colleagues, and then down a corridor decorated with information posters and handwritten bulletins. Barbara glanced through side doors at the bustling staff, almost all men. However far in the future they were, people still created mountains of paperwork. Files and folders were crammed onto shelves, under furniture, or sprawled across desks. Their escort stopped at a door marked "Interview Room" and motioned them inside. The room was dank and needed repainting. There was no window. The policeman told them to take the seats on the far side of a plain table. When they had done so, the policeman left, locking the door behind him. "What are we—" Barbara began, but the doctor wagged his index finger. "They're watching us." He pointed up at the mirror on the wall. They sat in silence, waiting. Some time later, an officer brought them pale and undrinkable tea. They left their mugs still full on the table. They waited. The doctor drummed his fingers. The door swung open, and in came a bearded man in his 60s, a piece of paper in his hand. The doctor stood up to greet him, but the man told them to sit. He had a portly, friendly face, his eyes tired but kind. His beard, flecked with grey, needed trimming, and his lab coat was well worn. He looked like he might have slept in it. "Professor Kelly," he said, as he plumped down in the seat opposite them. His tone was gruff and impatient. He didn't want to be here either. "You passed on the offer of tea," he said. "Best thing, really." "I am the doctor, and this—" "Dr. Chesterton, is it?" said Kelly, checking his piece of paper. Before the doctor could correct him, Barbara interrupted. They mustn't give Ian and Susan away. "You already have our names?" "Desk sergeant minuted the call you made," said Kelly. Barbara took care not to respond, not to look at the doctor. She didn't even flinch. Ian and Susan had found a phone. So where were they now? Professor Kelly amended the notes on his paper, adding, "Doctor." His writing was terrible, while the desk sergeant's original notes were easy to read, even upside down. Barbara stopped short. The date was given at the top of the page. Saturday, 24th of June, 2006. Barbara gazed in wonder. She liked to know the date wherever the doctor landed them, the past or the future. She could add it to her timeline. As a teacher, she would always start a new class by swiping a line of chalk right across the blackboard. At one end, she would mark an X for 1066, and at the other end, an X for today. The class would then help her fill in the important dates in between. Magna Carta, the Spanish Armada, the Battle of Waterloo. It helped the children make sense of where history fitted, and she liked to think it helped them make sense of where they were too. Of course, some children would ask for things like the dinosaurs or their birthdays to go on the line. You found out in that first lesson who the live wires would be for the rest of the year. Barbara prided herself that she could always make the timelines work, whatever dates they threw at her. Travelling with the doctor, she still kept a timeline, in her head at least. 1289, 1794, 1692. She found years from history easiest. The future, running on after the final X, didn't seem so real. The blackboard wouldn't reach that far. The 28th century, the 30th. They were so far beyond what she knew she didn't need to worry. That's what she would have said to her pupils. Those years were probably out in the playground. 2006 was different. For all it was the future, for all it was so far beyond her home, she could still easily see it. It would be the wall beside the blackboard, a hand's span from her own time. June 24th, 2006. Not really the future at all. "You found the body?" asked Kelly, snapping Barbara back to the present. His manner was terse, like he had better things to be doing than interrogate them. Perhaps, she thought, he already assumed them guilty of murder. "You're not with the police?" asked the doctor. Of course, thought Barbara. The man had a lab coat on. He probably worked with Andrews, though he didn't seem that bothered about the death. "That's a question of perspective. I've a rank and number just like everyone else. Now, your papers." The doctor patted his pockets sadly. "We must have mislaid them." "I see." He scribbled something illegible down on his paper. "We didn't murder the colonel," said the doctor. "I never said you did. But you were wandering about the station at," he checked his watch, "2 in the morning, and you just stumbled over him. Bit of a coincidence, isn't it?" "I'm sorry if we've got you out of bed," said the doctor. "We heard him fall," said Barbara. "He cried out. We think he may have arrived—" She tailed off. The doctor was glaring at her. Kelly sat back in his chair and filled his pipe. "Go on," he said, and his voice had changed, now curious, provocative, dangerous even. He lit the pipe, and acrid yellow smoke crept hesitantly from the bowl. It had a cheap, oily smell. "He may have arrived at the station too hurriedly," said the doctor. "Missed his footing on those stairs." He paused. "What else could we mean?" "I see," said Kelly. "You know that vagrancy is an offence here." "Vagrants?" said the doctor. "We're certainly not vagrants. We're visitors." "You've your own money?" "Yes." This obviously surprised Kelly. He sat forward. "Really?" "In a range of denominations going back some 40 years, said the doctor, with meaning. Barbara realized he meant the money they had taken from the dead man. He and Kelly stared at each other. Kelly finally smiled. They were caught up in a battle of wills, thought Barbara. Why did the doctor always have to be up to something? Honesty was the better policy. It was less likely to land them in it up to their necks. "You'll forgive the heavy-handed approach," said Kelly, the doctor evidently having convinced him of something. "This area has a major vagrancy problem. Always has done. That's why they built this place, to deal with them all." "You find them places to live, to work?" "Those who can work, yes." "And the rest?" "They are taken out of the equation, shall we say." He spoke with no hint of threat, but nor did he disguise to what he was alluding. "You execute them?" asked Barbara, appalled. "Not me personally." The look on her face must have spoken volumes. He tried again more agreeably. "We do try to find them useful roles, but many are confused and unsuited to any form of work. They merely drain our already limited resources." "That's barbaric," said Barbara. "Well, I'm no politician, but if the policy is hard on them, it only matches the situation we find ourselves in. You do know what's going on around us." "Of course," said the doctor, before Barbara could speak. "You'd be amazed by the numbers we get in who don't. Confusion reigns." "But you know we're different," said the doctor. I think so, but you'll need to convince me. Tell me about yourselves. Who are you? Where are you from? His smile flickered just for a moment. And when? Colonel Andrews, I presume? Ian helped the man to his feet. The colonel's neck was red, imprinted with the shape of the tramp's hands. Ian had rugby tackled the tramp, dragged him bodily from the colonel. The tramp had sized Ian up, not liked his chances against both men, and hurried off. "And you are?" said Andrews. Though hoarse, his voice was sharp, educated, old school. He had a dashing, silent movies look about him. His hair was slicked back, and he sported a pencil moustache. "I'm Ian Chesterton. This is Susan." Susan stepped forward into the moonlight. She was skittish, suspicious. "I'll be. You're bally civilians." Andrews could not hide his shock. The very idea was ludicrous, it seemed. "Yes. Had some training in the military arts, though, I see. Jolly grateful for that. Let me tell you, thought I was toast." It looked like an unprovoked attack. "I'll say. Something queer going on here, I'm bound. Not often the Isle of Dogs is open to the public." Ian could have leapt for joy. They were in London. This had once been the East India Docks, he thought. His own time had been their heyday. They had never been more busy or prosperous, even at the height of the empire. He wondered how much time had gone by since then to bring them to this. How long did the docks he remembered have left? He wavered, unsure what to say next. They had so much to learn from the colonel. Yet, what reason did he have to trust them? What could Ian do for him? "We found your card," said Susan, nudging Ian in the side. The colonel's eyes narrowed. "My card?" Ian held out the identity card, the plastic finish gleaming in the light. Andrews did not take it. From a safe distance, he inspected the details. "Where in heavens did you find that?" "In the station. It is yours, then?" "Afraid not, young lady. But it is your picture, your name." "Oh, that's me, all right. Good likeness, too. But I have my card right here." He opened one flap of his lab coat. Pinned inside was an identical card. No, not identical when Ian looked closer. In this picture, Andrews had his head slightly to one side. Ian held his own card up for comparison. The two photographs, though different, could have been from the same sitting. "And you said these couldn't be duplicated," he said to Susan. "I should report this," said Andrews. "It may be important." "Report it to who?" said Ian. "I work not far from here." "We'll come with you." Andrews eyed him suspiciously, but Ian stood firm. "Good plan. They may want to quiz you anyway," said Andrews. There was something threatening in his tone. Ian and Susan followed him down the street. Susan kept nudging Ian, trying to warn him off. They shouldn't go far, Ian knew. They might lose both the station and the TARDIS. They were heading away from where the Doctor and Barbara had been taken too. Yet they had no choice, he reminded himself. Andrews was their only lead. They turned a corner, emerging into a street lined with fountains and neatly tailored patterns of grass. It all seemed unreal, too clinical and corporate. Ian couldn't imagine people actually living and working here. Again, he couldn't comprehend how somewhere as neat and perfect as this could remain standing while the horizon burnt orange with fire. He thought he could smell the flames, even this far away. Perhaps it was memories from his youth, the smell of London at war ingrained into him. As they walked, Ian found himself coming up with more and more questions. Why had there been no sirens, no anti-air artillery? Had London really been so beaten down? And why leave the Isle of Dogs unscathed? In the war Ian remembered, the docks had been a primary target for the bombers, the whole East End made to suffer for them. What had changed? What was going on? He had so many things to consider that he walked slap into Andrew's back. The man had stopped suddenly on the corner of a street. There were no cars about, no traffic. He might have done it on purpose. Susan's eyes were on Andrews as he looked all around. He marched off across the road, But Susan caught Ian's arm before he could follow. "He's our only lead," Ian told her. "But Ian," she whispered, "he doesn't even know where he's going." Barbara's jaw hung open. The doctor said nothing, though she could see him barely holding back his emotions. Was it anger or fear? Had he been outplayed? "What did you take us for?" laughed Kelly. "You've come back to see our project in action." The doctor glared at the man. "I should say it's of great interest," he said eventually. "Ha!" said the professor, slapping his hand down on the table. "I knew this would happen. We made it work, didn't we?" The doctor stroked his lip. "You will have to appreciate that it would be wrong of me to comment at this stage," he said. Barbara was horrified. Surely he couldn't be going along with this fascistic regime, even if they were travelling in time. Kelly's eyes twinkled. "But the fact that you're here," he said. "As I say, we cannot comment." No, thought Barbara. The doctor was playing a more considered game. Kelly took the doctor to be an ally, and the doctor neither corrected him of that notion nor committed himself to anything either. "Of course, you'll be bound by protocols," said Kelly, all seriousness now. "Careless talk and all that." "Indeed," said the doctor, clearly enjoying himself. "Please," said Barbara, "you've not said how you knew Colonel Andrews." "Knew?" said Kelly. "Andrews works for me." "Worked," corrected the doctor. He must have realised how that sounded. "I didn't mean—" he began. No, said Kelly. "I quite understand your concern. It's been quite a shock to us as well. But let me assure you, the Colonel is perfectly well." "But he's broken his neck," the doctor insisted. "Has he now? Why don't I introduce you both to him?" He stood, folding the piece of paper up and shoving it into a pocket. "I can show you where it's all happening, too." "It's got me quite jiggered," Andrews admitted. "The very moment I think I've got my bearings, something's off bat again." They were back in the square with the fountains. Ian and Susan had followed the Colonel up and round and down the streets between skyscrapers, only to land back where they had started. "But you do know the area?" asked Ian. He was finding this difficult. He couldn't shake from his mind the image of Andrews from before, lying dead at the foot of the escalator, his head wrenched backwards from his body. The more they followed the Andrews with them now, the closer the man got to his death. It stood to reason. It couldn't happen any other way. No matter how lost they were, every step took them nearer to the man's death. Perhaps, Ian thought, he and Susan would be caught up in however he died. But what other choice did they have but to stick with him? "I've worked in Canary Wharf for nearly a decade, since before the war," Andrews said, craning his neck as he looked all around. He froze. Something had caught his attention. He scurried across the square for a better look. Susan took the chance to whisper again to Ian. "He might not be in his own time," she said. "You mean he's jumped ahead? That would explain why he's lost, wouldn't it?" "You think we should confront him?" "I don't think—" She fell silent as Andrews hurried back to them. He had his notebook out, checking what he had written earlier. "Things are definitely different," he said, wide-eyed. "The bridge is in a different place altogether. And you noticed the gates were missing at the station?" "Yes," said Ian, wondering where this was going. "They lock the place up at night. I've been caught out working late. This time of night I thought I'd be locked in, but the gates hadn't been there for years." "You think they sent you forward?" said Ian. Andrews nodded, not appearing to notice what Ian had given away. "Possibly. Maybe that spatial dislocation is a symptom of—" He started scribbling in his notebook, his writing erratic, almost crazed. He looked up to say something, and stopped. Andrews stared wide-eyed at a building down the street. It looked like all the others, pristine, new, anonymous. But it meant something to him. He grinned. "That's it," he said, amazed. "That's the one." They emerged from the gloomy corridor into the laboratory. The odour of old eggs and gas immediately reminded Barbara of Ian's own labs back at Coal Hill. A man in a dirty lab coat worked at the tall workbench that ran all the way round the room. There were gas taps and plugs at regular intervals. In one corner, large machines clanked and whirred. They looked no different from those she had seen in her own time, slow, valve-driven, and prone to moths. Through a window in the far wall, Barbara could see some kind of testing room. Inside stood a thick metal hoop as tall as she was. Scientists fussed around it, poking, prodding, and making notes. They were fastidious in their work. In fact, the whole lab was spotless clean, not at all like the mayhem of paper she had seen at Bing Street. The lab technician turned round from his work. His hair was a mess. "Oh," he said, "I thought it would be more—" "Get on with your work, Griffiths," said Kelly. The doctor stepped forward, tapping his finger against his lips as he surveyed the lab. He pointed at the testing room as he turned back to Kelly. He looked furious. "I take it," he began. "Barbara!" A thrill went through Barbara. Ian had emerged from a side door. Susan quickly followed him out, running to the doctor and throwing her arms around him. The doctor stroked her hair. Barbara took Ian's hands. Her eyes picked over every familiar detail of his face, wowed by the sudden relief at having him back. "How are you?" he said, the same relief she felt evident in his voice. "We were arrested," she said. "This is London, 2006. "We're at war again," Ian nodded. "The police didn't hold you, though. We saw you taken away." She didn't have a chance to answer. "Just who are these people?" snapped Kelly. "I'm Ian Chesterton. This is Susan." "You're the ones who made the report." Kelly turned to the doctor. "You're his father, aren't you?" "I am the doctor, as I said. You wrote it down. This young lady is Barbara. I think there has been some confusion on your part. You deliberately—" "Sir," said the timid-looking scientist. "They came in with the Colonel." He scratched at his jaw nervously. "Should I put the kettle on again?" Kelly let out a sigh. "Very well, Griffiths, you do that." Griffiths bobbed through the side door and out of view. "I suppose you were being cautious," said Kelly to the doctor. "Best thing around the soldiers." The doctor was eager to change the subject. "You said you would show us around this experiment of yours, I must say it all looks in order. Spick and span, in fact." "Doctor," said Ian, "there's something you should see." "In good time, Chesterton. We must see what they're up to here, mustn't we?" "But Colonel Andrews," said Susan. "Now, Susan." Barbara gasped as the side door opened. A strikingly handsome man emerged. His hair was slicked down, and he sported a sly moustache. "Someone shout," said Colonel Andrews, offering his hand to the doctor. "I'm Andrews," he said warmly. "Gather you're here to shed light on our little hitch." The doctor shook the man's hand, his eyes flickering to Susan and Ian. "I would be glad to help," he said. "It's not possible," said Barbara. The man smiled at her, holding his arms out as if inviting her to prod him. She couldn't hold his gaze and looked down. He had those same square-toed shoes on. Barbara felt her eyes prickle with tears. Griffiths appeared again, brandishing a metal tin of tea leaves. He spoke to no one in particular, avoiding their eyes as he glanced all round. "How do you all take it? We've not had sugar in ages, of course." "Barbara," said Ian, "the Colonel here isn't the man we found." Griffiths looked down at Barbara. "Oh, didn't you know about—" "He has to be," said Barbara. "Look at him." "Sorry to disappoint, miss." Andrews grinned, waggling an eyebrow at her. "Come and see," said Ian. He led her up to the side door. A window in the door looked in on a mess room, small tables and chairs jostling in front of a kitchen. Various men in lab coats sat around, chatting, drinking tea, making sandwiches, generally taking time off from their work. They all had the same uniform kind of haircut. Perhaps their hair gel was military issue. And then she got it. She took a step back, her throat constricting, unable to speak her surprise. Every one of them in the room, all half-dozen of them, was Colonel Andrews.